So Sam, what do you think ethics is?
That's a really good question, Karen. I think ethics fundamentally is about doing the right thing for the right reasons at the right time. I think when we think about ethics, we're constantly thinking about filling in the correct forms, which is the procedure of ethics. But I think it's a lot more than that. I think it's about thinking deeply about things on a philosophical level, but also thinking on a day-to-day basis how I deal with everyday dilemmas. What do you think, Karen?
No, I think you're right. I think it's a really complex thing. It's about societal behaviour. It's about a recognition of the responsibilities and obligations that we have to people around us and objects around us. And I think it's about well-being, it's about understanding, it's about consent, informed consent, which in itself is a difficult issue.
That's interesting. That's often associated with ethics, getting people's consent. What is that? What makes something informed?
Well, again, that's complex. I mean, on a more pragmatic level, I suppose it's about letting people know that you are doing something to or with them, their work, their objects or their knowledge, and that will potentially go out into the public domain. And also that as a researcher or a practitioner or both, that what you're doing with or around those people or their things might be of some benefit or advantage to you as well. So there's a sort of maybe power relationship being established there as well. I think it's really important to be clear and frank about that.
So it's not really just about signing a form?
No, although that's important.
Because things change.
Of course.
Somebody may give their consent and then situations may change and they may decide that actually they regret saying they were going to be part of this research and want to withdraw, and that's their right too, isn't it?
Yes. Knowledge and consent, neither of them are fixed in time, in the same way that as people we're not fixed in time either.
And I suppose ethics is something you need to be constantly thinking about.
People change, things change, circumstances change, and the consequences of our decisions to give consent or withhold consent are far-reaching and not pinned down.
What would you like, Karen?
Can I just have a small Americano with some cold milk?
Is this polenta cake?
Yeah, it is.
Is it gluten-free?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's just the small black bread one.
Yes.
Do you think that actually ethics has an impact on the way that we respond to, use and think about objects and, materials?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, objects have lives, don't they? Objects are part of material culture. They're attached to places and spaces and times and ideologies and individuals, and they represent things and hold stories. So we need to be ethically aware of the consequences of those objects.
So, for example, our coffee that we're drinking, there's lots of ethical connotations about this, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, for instance, how is the coffee sourced?
Yeah.
Is it sourced ethically?
Yeah.
Is the way that we treat this object, if we treat it with care, even though it's a disposable cup, if we think about how we're treating this object, it has ethical implications. If we smash it up and it cannot be used again, that's unethical. If we throw it away when actually we could recycle it, that's unethical, in my opinion.
Maybe what's important is that we acknowledge that we are not necessarily the centre of our universe, and we look a little bit further outwards, maybe at the humble objects around us, and look at what they can tell us about bigger stories, as in this case about, sustainability or recycling, but also about how things are made, where they come from, whose lives are affected by our interaction with them. Definitely. Yeah.
I'm really interested as well, moving away from objects, is the kind of ethics around stories and storytelling and narrative. A lot of people are interested in stories, and really as a storyteller, especially if you're co-constructing a story with somebody else, or you're telling somebody else's story, there's a lot of responsibility in that. You've got to think about those stories go out there and can have a life of their own. So even telling a story has ethical consequences. What do you think about that?
I agree. I think some of my research involves narrative inquiry and storytelling, and I was warned at one point by somebody to be very careful about using that phrase, to give voice to.
Oh yes.
Because it's a very powerful phrase, and it talks to power and of power. What right have I got to give voice to anything? But I do really care about stories, so maybe my ethical imperative is to set out on the table that I'm not a neutral observer, that I am a person with my own agenda, that I do exist within the middle of these stories, and just be really clear and honest about that, rather than trying to pretend that I can, have this omnipotent
Authentic,
view, of looking down and telling somebody else's story. I don't think that's really my place.
Yeah, and also the idea that, people that we research are subjects or objects of our study. When perhaps when we're telling stories, we're actually telling stories with somebody, not about somebody. Does that make sense? They're telling the story with us, and acknowledging that perhaps. I think ethics has the power to enhance creativity and to make people think deeply about a situation or a subject. You cannot really act ethically without reflecting on what you do and imagining the consequences of your actions. And I think that's the way of extending your thinking around your own practice.
Yes, I suppose if we go back to what we said at the very beginning and remind ourselves that we said that ethics was about acting wisely, acting from a good place, trying to act well, acting for the greater good, about well-being and consent and understanding, and not placing ourselves and our practice and our individual wants and needs at the very heart of everything.
Totally agree with you. How do you collaborate with people, Karen? Do you think there's any issues with collaboration? It sounds great.
It does. Well, sometimes I suppose it can be very straightforward. You have a partner or partners, and you have a sort of contract negotiated, whether it's verbal or written. You work to that. Everything's sorted out and neat and tidy, and everybody's acknowledged either as equal contributors or as contributors in their own right. But of course, the real world, the world that we live in, the world where ethics is swirling around, is much more complicated than that. And sometimes it's important to have a conversation about collaborative relationships, about power, about how relationships can shift and change, and about how we are going to acknowledge the contributions of others.
I mean, I think that's really sensible to do that before you start any kind of project, any research project, for example, rather than going part way through a project and then realising you don't have mutual agreement about, who's going to be the first author, who's going to be acknowledged as a contributor, who is going to get the rights, editing rights over the project, whatever it is. It's also really important to think about how you acknowledge the work, even if somebody's not an author, they could have helped you in some way. So some kind of acknowledgement needs to be agreed. So it would be a real shame if these things weren't sorted out and it caused that the project faltered because of falling out.
Yes, there's issues around ownership, isn't there? And ownership of knowledge, ownership of practice. There's also the life that the work or works have after they've gone out into the world. and what happens to them there. And there's that really interesting word that you used, which is sort of about collaboration, but brings in other things, which is agreement. Because you may feel that you're on the same page as somebody, but as the situation unfolds,
you realise
there are so many complexities, aren't there?
this idea of risk. Part of ethics, I suppose, is thinking about risk. You've got to look after people in your practice or your research or your teaching practice. So kind of thinking about risk and, you know, the risks of what you do is really important so that you can mediate against that risk. And part of that is looking after yourself as a researcher, perhaps thinking, am I putting myself in danger? Am I in danger of perpetuate myself in a bad light? Am I at risk at representing my institution in a bad light? You know, you're responsible really for thinking about a lot of risks.
That doesn't mean to say that you can't or shouldn't have these ambitions, but it's about doing it within a context, isn't it? It's about recognising the consequences. One of the issues with making work that goes out into the public domain is that it captures a moment in time, and that moment in time remains. We change, we move on.
But that's there forever.
And its consequences linger.
So you've got to think about that, the risk of that. This place is really beautiful.
Yes, always love coming here.
And it's a beautiful day.
It is.
I don't know why, but this place, because it's quite quiet and contemplative, and it is really makes you think of the bigger things, bigger issues.
Yes.
So we have lots of memorials of people who have passed and gone. Do you think that there are any ethical issues when we're talking really about people who have passed away, 20, 30, 100 years ago?
Yeah, because I think we often have a very linear concept of time, and we see it as being, chronological, morning, afternoon, evening. We are our former selves all the time. So when we see something like this, it reminds us about the elasticity of time and about the continuance of stories and objects and people, and about how they remain in the world that we inhabit. And we weren't the first ones here. Yeah.
In a way, their stories are still being told.
Yes.
They're marked on the gravestones.
Yes.
How they're represented there. And, these may be still people's relatives.
Yeah.
But even if that's not the case, the kind of ethics around dealing with death, we treat death with respect.
Yes.
I'm thinking of a student that we had who dealt with these kind of issues to do with mourning and death, and they thought really carefully about how they represented their work. They really believed that these issues were ethical, even though some of the gravestones here are quite old.
Yes, I remember that situation, and for that student, those existences were still present for her, and she wanted to show respect and understanding of that. And in being careful, she also made some really wise and quite daring creative choices. So she wasn't shut down by ethical considerations. On the contrary, her practice was energised by ethical decisions that she made. Ethics has to be made in context, doesn't it?
Yes.
With a respect for and understanding of
Yes.
context. And an acknowledgement that telling of stories is very partial.
Yeah.
It's a partial telling of a story.
I mean, the families of people who paid for these memorials, they did that with a kind of trust that people would respect that, and it would be a way of memorialising them for a time in the future.
Yes, it was almost an act of faith. I don't mean necessarily religious faith, but an act of faith, an act of trust.
But you acknowledge that some people find this really important and really significant.
Yes.
This is great, isn't it? I think pretty, isn't it?
This is the path that you were talking about, which is also gravestones.
So we're walking on people's, we're not walking on people's bodies, but we're walking on people's stories.
Yes,
Yeah.
bring you back to that point of considering the bigger picture.